It is said that the Roman German king, Henry IV, humbled himself for 3 full days before Pope Gregory VII. The monarch is supposed to have gone to his very limits, standing barefoot and clad only in a penitential robe before the Alpine fortress of Canossa in January 1077, begging for forgiveness. At last, the head of the church relented, admitted the king, and lifted the ban he had imposed only a few months earlier. The Pope seemed to have triumphed in the so-called Investiture Controversy. That is how it appeared, and that is still how it is taught today. Canossa thus became a landmark event. The fact that, for example, the English King Henry II submitted to being whipped before the tomb of Thomas Becket about 90 years later as an act of atonement has often been understood as following the precedent of Canossa. Yet for some time now, historians have challenged the traditional interpretation of papal victory at Canossa. Claudia Zay, for example, put it plainly: Canossa was not the central turning point that it had long been stylized as in research. Even a superficial review of the facts shows that this is not wrong. Gregory died in exile 8 years after Canossa, while Henry had appointed his own pope, who in turn crowned him emperor. The supposedly defeated monarch had in reality gained the upper hand. How can this be explained? Welcome, or welcome back, to Lemmy history. The penitential walk to Canossa is one of the most striking and haunting images of the Middle Ages. It is no accident that it has endured through the centuries. During a confrontation between his government and the Catholic Church in Parliament, for instance, Otto von Bismarck reassured the deputies by declaring, "We are not going to Canossa." The Reich Chancellor thereby affirmed the enormous symbolic weight of Canossa. He was hardly alone in this. Time and again, terms such as world shaking have been used to describe what happened. The last major example in Germany was as recent as 2006, when an entire exhibition was devoted to the penitential procession. How then can we explain the shift? For so long, Canossa was regarded as a decisive event in history, marking the victory of spiritual authority over secular power. Today, however, it is increasingly portrayed as a tactical maneuver by Henry. To understand this change, we must first clarify a few key terms. In our context, the Investiture Controversy refers to the conflict over who had the right to appoint ecclesiastical office holders, the secular ruler or the Pope. The Church possessed vast estates across Europe that lay outside the reach and jurisdiction of secular authority. Within Henry's empire, there existed the so-called imperial church system, which sharpened the problem further. Under this arrangement, bishops and abbots were endowed not only with spiritual responsibilities, but also with secular possessions and lordship rights. Kings and emperors repeatedly argued that, as their secular superiors, they should also retain the right of appointment. For centuries, this assumption went largely unchallenged. Indeed, the papacy itself had long been among the offices over which the Roman German rulers believed they exercised supremacy. To understand this, we unfortunately have to begin far back at the roots. I will, however, try to explain it as briefly and as clearly as possible. The papacy itself dates back to the ancient Roman Empire. At that time, the emperor held clear supremacy over the head of the church, but he was also the protector of the Pope and the Christians. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, this role passed to the Byzantine emperor, who continued to exercise authority over the Patriarch of Constantinople. In his eyes, both the Patriarch and the Pope were more or less equal, and both were subordinate to him. By the 8th century, however, the Eastern Roman ruler was no longer able to protect the Pope effectively. The pontiff, therefore, turned to the Frankish kingdom. The Carolingians were to replace the Byzantines as protectors, and in return, the Pope would recognize the family's head, Pippin, as king. Although Pippin already wielded de facto power, the royal title still formally belonged to the Merovingian dynasty. Pippin accepted this arrangement, and his son Charles eventually rose to the rank of emperor. Thus, the papacy became directly dependent on the Frankish realm. Yet the reverse was also true. The Frankish rulers had, perhaps without realizing it, tied their legitimacy to papal approval. In the 9th century, the Frankish realm finally fractured. In the east arose the predecessor of what would later become Germany, while France took shape in the west. The Roman Empire, in theory, stood above these two successor states, but was in practice represented by the eastern ruler. Out of this situation, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation gradually came into being. Nevertheless, both the eastern ruler, the king of the so-called Regnum Teutonicum, and the king of France claimed to be the protector of the Pope. This is particularly evident in the late Middle Ages, when the papacy temporarily relocated to France and was clearly subordinate to the French crown. At the same time, Rome was dominated by competing noble clans who constantly fought one another and used the papacy as a tool in their struggles. For centuries, only the Frankish ruler was capable of enforcing real peace in the city. Yet such a stable Rome was essential for the functioning of the Curia as a whole. The medieval emperors, in turn, saw themselves as heirs to the ancient Roman rulers. They supported only those popes who suited them. For them, papal coronation and the symbolic confirmation of divine legitimacy mattered far more than any notion of papal power over them. No one demonstrated this more decisively than Henry III, father of Henry IV. Henry III deposed several popes and installed new ones. One of these was Victor II, whom he entrusted with the education of his young son when it became clear that the emperor would die unexpectedly early. Henry IV was only 6 years old at the time. The emperors were fairly effective at stabilizing the overall structure of the church, but they did little to remedy the deep-seated abuses that had grown over centuries. Chief among these was simony, the buying and selling of offices. Noble families paid immense sums to secure high clerical positions, and kings and emperors themselves profited greatly from this practice. Chastity was widely ignored, with many clerics married and raising families. Popes often acted more like warlords than spiritual leaders. As early as the 10th century, a reform movement had taken shape to combat these problems, with the monastery of Cluny playing a pioneering role. The Salian dynasty, to which Henry IV belonged, was sympathetic to these reforms. Abbot Hugh of Cluny was even the king's godfather, and Henry III had deposed popes largely because they opposed reform. Agnes, wife of the emperor, mother of Henry IV, and for a time regent, maintained excellent relations with many reformers. Among them was a monk named Hildebrand, who spent several years in what is now Germany. We will meet him again. With the backing of the imperial family, the church developed a decree on papal elections that allowed the pope to be chosen independently. Yet Henry IV also received the title of Patricius of Rome, a role whose rights in papal elections were left undefined. This vagueness proved a serious mistake. Despite their sympathy for the reforming popes, the kings were bound to clash with them. The buying of offices could only be eradicated if the pope had the sole authority to appoint bishops, but this directly restricted the rights of the Roman German king, for bishops and abbots held a double role within the empire. They were both spiritual leaders and secular princes. Gregory VII, who took office in 1073, went further still, declaring a complete ban on lay investiture. Kings could no longer appoint bishops at all. Henry IV responded by declaring the pope deposed. Gregory was unmoved and excommunicated the king in return. He stripped Henry of all rights of dominion and released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Nothing like this had ever happened before. At first, Henry remained relatively unconcerned. His princes, however, demanded that he secure the lifting of the excommunication, or else they would elect another king. And this brings us to Canossa. Whether Henry was truly a repentant sinner cannot be answered with certainty. What is clear is that his aim was to foil the prince's plan by performing penance. In this, he partly succeeded, for Gregory did accept him back into the church. But how harmonious the relationship between the two men really was is open to question. At the subsequent banquet, the king is said to have refused both food and drink. According to historian Jörg Althoff, this was a deliberate gesture to avoid creating legal dependency, since dining at the Pope's table would have implied formal recognition of papal authority in the matter. This was not simply about excommunication, but about an additional imposition from the princes. Henry was also to undergo a test of his suitability as king on the 2nd of February 1077 in Augsburg, a proceeding to be held under the presidency of the Pope. How far this was a genuine trial remains controversial among scholars, and we will return to that question later. What is certain is that Henry was not prepared to accept it. The king had already come into conflict with Gregory's predecessor, Alexander II. The struggle over the appointment to the Archdiocese of Milan had even led to outbreaks of violence. The Pope responded by excommunicating some of Henry's advisors. Intended as a warning to the king, the measure backfired. It had not been the advisors who installed an archbishop in Milan. It was the king himself. Thus, the head of the church had punished men merely for opinions he disliked, though they had done nothing unlawful. Moreover, Pope Alexander attempted to dictate to Henry which advisors he might or might not have at court. When Alexander died in 1073, relations between Pope and king were already at a low point. Matters then deteriorated further. The Roman people demanded that the monk Hildebrand be elevated as the next pope. During his exile in Germany, he had sworn never to accept election as head of the church. Moreover, this acclamation by the populace violated the papal election decree, and Henry, as Roman-German king, was not consulted at all. Although the precise meaning of his role as Patricius of Rome had been left undefined, it certainly was not meant to be ignored entirely. Nevertheless, the Roman clergy complied with the demand, and Hildebrand accepted the office, taking the name Gregory VII. From Henry's perspective, events appeared as follows. The previous pope had already overstepped his authority. The new pope was a liar, unlawfully chosen, who accepted an election that disregarded the king's rights and his honor as Patricius of Rome. To Gregory's credit, he did recognize that Henry had legitimate grievances. As a first step, the new pope released the king's advisors from their ban. He also contemplated raising and leading a Christian army to drive back the Muslims threatening Constantinople. And in the meantime, he proposed to entrust the leadership of the church to Henry. Henry accepted these gestures and wrote to the Pope expressing regret for his youthful sins, promising to reform his conduct. In reality, he was at that time engaged in war in Saxony, and his conciliatory words were most likely intended to secure his rear for the campaign. Once victorious in Saxony, Henry invested several bishops in northern Italy in 1075, an act Gregory opposed. Gregory then wrote to Henry, demanding obedience. In Rome, he also drafted an internal memorandum that entered history as the Dictatus Papae, the dictate of the Pope. This collection of guiding principles defined in part the scope of papal power, including the claim to install and depose kings. By this point, the investiture controversy had evolved far beyond a dispute over lay investiture into a full-scale struggle between secular and spiritual authority. Henry, meanwhile, felt strong enough to prevail. At the turn of the year, 1075-1076, he had his 2-year-old son, Conrad, elected co-king. Shortly afterwards, he convened a synod of imperial bishops calling upon Gregory to step down from the throne of Peter. The king declared him deposed. In the corresponding decree, Gregory was addressed merely as Monk Hildebrand. The king argued that the Pope had not been lawfully elected and that Hildebrand had therefore seized the chair of Peter illegally. From a legal standpoint, Henry had a case. Yet in the 3 years since Hildebrand's elevation, the king had recognized him as Pope Gregory multiple times, and such recognition could not simply be revoked. In any event, the Pope was unimpressed. He excommunicated Henry and released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. This unprecedented step caused many of the king's supporters to abandon him. The monarch himself, however, remained calm. Since he did not consider Gregory to have been legitimately elected, the excommunication carried no weight in his eyes. For Henry, the situation was now clear. The church stood leaderless, while a mere monk presumed to act as pope. This constituted a grave crisis. As Roman German king and patricius of Rome, Henry believed he not only had the right, but the duty to rescue the church. After all, his office was that of its traditional protector, and it would not be the first time that the institution required defense against internal enemies. Ironically, the German princes largely agreed with this reasoning. They too disliked the idea that the Pope could make and unmake kings, for the election of the king was their prerogative. Yet many of them despised Henry personally. He was ruthless, corrupt, and, if the testimony of his second wife Praxedis is to be believed, sadistic. The confrontation with Gregory thus offered them the perfect opportunity to rid themselves of him. They laid down 2 conditions. Henry must obtain release from his excommunication and submit to the trial in Augsburg. The king would never fulfill both demands. The princes had judged correctly, yet they underestimated the fact that the Salian king was capable of learning. Henry obtained release from his excommunication, but by taking part in the communal meal, he implicitly rejected the Pope's legal authority over him as king. In Henry's view, Gregory and the princes had confused 2 matters that ought to be kept strictly separate: his human soul and his royal office. For his salvation, the Pope certainly bore responsibility, but nothing beyond that. Thus, Henry the man submitted to the Pope in order to obtain release from the Church's ban. According to this interpretation, King Henry IV was never under papal jurisdiction at all. His royal authority had only been obstructed because the princes demanded that his excommunication be lifted. Once that condition was met, Henry could resume the full exercise of his office. The princes, however, had anticipated this outcome. That was precisely why they sought to examine Henry's personal suitability for kingship. Gregory was to preside, but ultimately the princes claimed the right to decide. Henry countered that they had already elected him. There existed no law that allowed them to test his fitness after the fact. As a result, the proposed review in Augsburg never took place. Many princes instead elected a new king, considering Henry thereby deposed. Their candidate was Rudolph of Swabia, the king's own brother-in-law, who had gained this position by abducting Henry's sister and forcing her into marriage. The princes expected Gregory to confirm their new king, but the Pope withheld his support. After all, Gregory had claimed not only the right to depose kings, but also the right to appoint them. The election of Rudolph directly undermined this assertion of papal supremacy. For 3 years, the empire was torn by civil war, with Gregory caught uncomfortably between the two sides. Only in 1080 did he finally grant papal recognition to the anti-king Rudolf. Disaster followed swiftly. Rudolf triumphed in one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages, but was mortally wounded in his right hand, the very hand used for oaths. Henry seized upon this with satisfaction. Rudolf, the Pope's candidate, had been struck down in his oath hand. His death, Henry proclaimed, was nothing less than God's judgment on Gregory. Henry marched on Rome with an army, among which was Archbishop Wybert of Ravenna, a reform-minded cleric, but loyal to the king. At a synod of Italian bishops, Henry arranged for Gregory to be declared deposed. Wybert was elevated as the new head of the church, taking the name Clement III. In Rome, Gregory withdrew into Castel Sant'Angelo, while the rest of the city fell under his rival's control. Then Gregory made his fatal mistake. He summoned the Normans for aid. They came, but plundered and ravaged the region so savagely that the Romans themselves drove Gregory out. From 1084 onwards, Clement was the undisputed pope in Rome. He crowned Henry emperor. Gregory fled to Salerno, and his supporters elected rival popes. Among them, Urban II stood out, establishing himself in France under the protection of another traditional defender of the church. Yet it would take nearly 20 years before his successors could regain a lasting foothold in Rome. For the moment, Henry IV had achieved an unequivocal victory. As we have seen, Canossa was certainly no pleasant experience for Henry. Yet the penitential walk itself was not decisive for him. Far more important were the Pope's dissolution of his subjects' oaths and the reactions of the princes. The most striking reinterpretation of Canossa comes from the German historian Johannes Fried. Fried is among the most respected figures in the field, though his work has often provoked debate. He developed a new method of source interpretation, which he calls memorics, drawing on insights from neuroscience. I will not go into detail here, since memorics reach far beyond the scope of this video. The essential point is simple. No written source can ever be trusted completely, for subjective influences always shape what is recorded. Fried also examined Italian sources that had previously gone largely unnoticed. On this basis, he argues that Henry IV and Gregory VII had already been corresponding for half a year and may even have formed an alliance at Canossa. This would explain Gregory's long hesitation before supporting the anti-King Rudolf. It does not, however, account for Henry's refusal to take part in the communal feast. Fried dismisses the relevant source as belonging to the papal camp. His interpretation has been sharply challenged by Gerd Althoff, Stefan Weinfurter, and Stefan Patzold. For our purposes, the conclusion is straightforward. We do not actually know what happened at Canossa, beyond the single fact that Gregory released Henry from excommunication. Even the precise dates remain uncertain, which is why I have chosen to omit them. But how important was Canossa, really? The answer is this. The penitential walk became the symbol of the Investiture Controversy, and in that symbolic role it is very important. But this has also led to overinterpretation. Let me give you an example that my viewers who are here for English history will appreciate. Henry IV was eventually succeeded not by his rebellious son Conrad, but by his other son, Henry V. This Henry married Matilda, who came from what is now England. He forced his imperial coronation by military means and even kidnapped the Pope. During the ceremony, word spread that the emperor had extracted sweeping concessions from the Pope in the investiture conflict. Riots broke out, the coronation was interrupted, and afterwards the Pope was compelled under duress to perform a second coronation. The Church later declared both coronations invalid. The first, because it had not been properly completed, the second because it was not freely given. Henry, however, did not care, and neither did his wife. In English history, Empress Matilda is remembered as the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. She never gave up the title of Empress, and her son Henry II built on that legacy. When Henry II performed his famous public penance after the murder of Thomas Becket, it was not because he wished to submit to the supremacy of the Church in principle. Just like Henry IV at Canossa, it was a tactical maneuver to preserve his rule. So in the end, Canossa is best understood as a powerful image. It shows us how decisive symbols and rituals were in the high medieval struggle between secular and spiritual authority. But in itself, it was nothing more. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe.